Good afternoon, Ms. Tooze. We are really happy to have you here in the studio of Invest for Sight, a media partner for Gaidar Forum arranged by the National Presidential Academy of National Economy, of which we all are participants. And we would really appreciate to learn some opinions of you as an outstanding, let me put it this way, expert in economic history and economic troubles, because we're all concerned about troubles, first of all. So, having been here, having heard some speeches already, what would you say is a major problem that Russian economy is facing these days?
Well, I think the question that's on the mind of Russian policymakers, as it is in the West as well, is really the question of where quite advanced societies with high levels of education and good basic infrastructure, where they get further impetus for growth from, where that extra productivity is going to come from. I think that's really the common agenda in Russia and Europe, in the United States. Even in China, we have seen very substantial reductions in productivity growth rates in the great growth success story of recent decades, China's productivity.
By the way, sorry to interrupt you, would you say that it's impossible for productivity to keep growing forever? I mean, is there any limit for productivity? We have seen over the past decades or centuries or thousands of years, I would say, that the productivity keeps growing.
Yes.
On the other hand, will it keep growing forever, at least for our lifetime, just to secure this prospect?
Viewed over a millennial time horizon, it's not true that productivity was always growing. I mean, there are long periods of time in which there's very little measurable productivity growth anywhere in the world economy. Or there are periods where you have bursts of a couple of hundred years of improvement and then a sudden collapse. The experience that we've been benefiting from in Western Europe since the late 1600s and then in large parts of the world in the second half of the 20th century, sustained rapid productivity growth is historically unique and unprecedented, and it's what has enabled the planet to carry, the huge population that we currently have without mass outbreaks of starvation. I don't think there's any reason to expect an absolute limit, a steady state. After all, what are we measuring? We're measuring output in the broadest possible sense, where the limits of the human imagination are the only fundamental limit. So I see no reason to believe that we will reach an absolute limit to productivity, but we may, in large parts of the world, be beyond the point where you can achieve the sudden, huge step forward that you get if you take somebody from being an inefficient peasant farmer and make them into an industrial worker. That multiplies their productivity by a huge amount. Without any kind of productivity change, it's just a reallocation of the same scarce resource from one place to another. Those sorts of gains in productivity may get scarcer and scarcer, but that will be the dark side, if you like, of spectacular progress.
Right, and many experts these days start talking about a new crisis that we are to expect in the very near future, maybe this year that has already come. Would you share such a view that we are approaching, well, not maybe a crisis, but we're approaching something, some dramatic change in economic behavior or in economic stability or in overall global economic environment, I think financial environment, whatever you...
I think what there is a consensus on is the probability of a slowdown, which is a long way short of any of those nasty terms that you were using. I don't think many people are predicting an imminent crisis. The one place in the world where there are large, possibly unknown risks is China. I think that's the one zone where people expect where the people see the possibility of a real crisis, a non-linear, shocking kind of development. But it's only a probability. It's by no means a certainty. What we see in the West, in Europe, already in the last 2 quarters, a dramatic slowdown in Eurozone growth from a relatively high rate of growth in 2017 to a considerably more modest growth rate. And in the United States, likewise, it would be surprising if there wasn't some slowdown, because after all, this is a recovery which has now been going on since 2009, which is one of the longest and will be the longest in American history. So a slowdown, yes, quite probable. A crisis, I think, quite unlikely.
And that slowdown that you mentioned, is it due to some, well, just a cyclic development of the global economy, or is it man-made? do you think that there are forces in this world that willingly or unwillingly do contribute to worsening the situation for the rest of the world and ultimately for themselves?
No, I mean, it's quite clear, I think, that the shock of the American turn under the Trump administration towards an aggressive nationalist trade policy is really destabilizing, because it disturbs an image that the vast majority of business leaders, economic experts around the world had of our likely future. And instead now we're facing the prospect of an escalating trade war. Now, that by itself, I think, is not large enough to cause a shock. It would have to extend to a sector like automobiles, which is a deeply interconnected, truly globalized sector, to begin to have really macroeconomic effects. Soybeans and so on will hurt farmers in particular parts of the United States, but it won't cause a macroeconomic shock. But if we escalate towards sectors like auto, then I think we're beginning to talk about a really fundamental break in the narrative of global economic development. And in the end, as flimsy as it may seem, it is stories, it is expectations about long-run future development which drive investment. And there I think we could see really significant shift. And this is largely, one would have to say, self-inflicted on the part of the Trump administration. But of course, you can also point to the deep structural changes that are going on and the assertive, energetic, not to say aggressive way in which China has pursued those. China has set about becoming a major manufacturing and tech superpower. And that, not surprisingly, makes the incumbent nervous. And so these reactions on the American side may appear like the whims of an irrational old man, but they also reflect, deep structural forces that are at work in the world economy. It would be surprising if America did not react in some way to the challenge that China poses, and one shouldn't expect, once Trump leaves the scene, for everything to go back to business as usual, as it was. That, I think, is a misunderstanding. There is a broad-based bipartisan view in the United States that China poses a fundamental challenge.
A major company from the US, Ford, is expected to shut down some of its facilities worldwide,
yes,
even including Russia, I believe. Do you think that's a sign of such a major shift that you are mentioning, that it's just one of the manifestations, that it is already happening?
We're seeing this across the board. So GM made also a similar huge announcement. VW has made a similar announcement. The auto sector is strategic. The auto sector is not just an old metal bashing sector of the 70s and 80s. It remains the most highly globalized, sophisticated manufacturing sector. And as we all know, it's undergoing a fundamental shift in technology. We're moving towards e-mobility, we're moving towards ride-sharing, we're moving towards self-driving vehicles. This is the obvious time horizon for personal mobility, a generation out. And so there is a huge reshuffling of the pack going on there. And what's really striking is that the incumbent manufacturers, particularly in Europe, don't have those technologies. There's not a single substantial battery plant in Europe right now with which to power a new generation of e-mobility. The German companies, which we think of as the dominant companies in the sector, are well behind the curve. And VW is the one which is making the most spectacular bid right now to address that. And it will have dramatic consequences for the workforce. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, if not more, are at risk. I think the estimate are that about 1.5 million jobs in Germany depend on the internal combustion engine. Just in Germany, just on the technology of internal combustion engines. Spark plugs, generators, that entire structure built up since the 1890s is all in jeopardy. And it's beginning with diesel, and you will have heard of the diesel scandals, German cities banning diesel cars. The German industry made a huge investment in diesel technology, all of which is now in jeopardy. So those are, I think, the building blocks of an industrial restructuring. Again, it's not obvious that that builds up to a 2008 crisis, because a 2008 crisis is not a bad case of the flu. It's not you getting arthritis in your economic arm. It's a heart attack. You're dead, you're dying in seconds. I mean, in 2008, in September, the world economy was days away from total meltdown. That's a very different kind of medicine, if you like. That's a very different physiology from a long 20-year crisis in the auto sector.
And once car manufacturing is losing its position as a global leader in manufacturing, what new industries would you name as ones to take the lead? Because, in this world, it just cannot be that something disappears or loses its weight or whatever its value, and nothing comes instead. So what do you expect to replace car manufacturing, automobile industry?
I don't think we know yet, to be absolutely honest, and these are the unknowable frontiers. If this is, I really am a historian. The guessing of future tech frontiers
historians are the ones to make the proper guess.
Historians are the people who can tell you what it's like when these kind of processes happen. And we know how big a shock, the second industrial revolution of the late 19th century was, how the chemical industry, the electrical engineer, the automotive industry, the aeronautics industry emerged. And we know what politics was built around those, including the Soviet project, which was nothing if not a spectacular instance of that heavy industrial complex. And we know what a shock that suffered in the 1970s and 80s as the new tech industries, electronics came along, and manufacturing both in the communist areas and, of course, in the West as well, became non-viable. And the Ruhr, the coal industry, the heavy industrial hub of Germany, shut down its last coal mine before Christmas. Steel is no longer made in the Ruhrgebiet. So, we know historically what those kind of transformations look like. If we're looking further forward, everybody's money, I think, is on tech, right? Everyone's money is on artificial intelligence, big data. But those are unlikely to be sectors which employ millions of people. It's hard to imagine a kind of the new working class of tech emerging, because they employ tiny groups of people. Where the workforce is in subcontracted manufacturing in Southeast Asia, and that's the smartphone model. But even the smartphone seems to be reaching its envelope. We know what troubles Apple's been having with the latest generation of iPhones. So we may be on the cusp of one of these steps in technology where new structures emerge. The pessimists, of course, say, we're basically all going to be made unemployed by artificial intelligence and robots. And there'll be jobs for nobody.
And, besides the trend in, people being made redundant, we have another trend, just recently experienced in Russia, for example, the high retirement age.
Yep.
So we get more people and less jobs. And where do we find ourselves in? What sort of a situation are we going to face in the very near future when the labor force is growing and jobs are diminishing?
So we better hope that the jobs which do persist are very high productivity, and then we're going to have to rely on taxation to redistribute. Because somebody is getting rich in this new system. It's just that the wealth and the income is being concentrated. It's no longer being spread out in the old Fordist model where Ford had to pay his car workers enough to buy the cars, right? That's the basic model of the consumerist, expansive motor of economic growth in the 1920s and 30s that was carried forward into the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. If that model no longer applies, then we have to rely on the public authorities to do, a heavy work of redistribution, because as in this scenario you're sketching, there are corporations which are making incredible rates of return on whatever capital they invest, very small numbers of highly skilled workers with very high wages, and then presumably an underclass of people who provide them with human services, cut their hair, make sandwiches for them or whatever, whose incomes will be very low because their productivity is low. So then you are really going to have to rely on various types of redistribution, which is why in the West, I don't know whether there's a discussion in Russia, but minimum income guarantees, job guarantees, these kind of themes are the stuff of progressive politics in the West now, because to address precisely this potential crisis.
Basically, you say that we are completing some circle in historical economic development of the global population and come back to the situation when there is a very tiny percentage of the population that controls majority of wealth, as it used to be several thousand years ago, and the rest of the population is just living on whatever is left unappropriated by that tiny percentage. So is it a crisis?
Well, we don't.
A historical crisis of human economic mentality?
Well, I think it's a huge challenge to politics. It really is a huge challenge to politics.
But the solution is in politics. It's not in economy, not in technology. It's a political instrument that has to be employed to somehow resolve the situation?
I think we're well past the point where we're any longer optimistic that the natural tendency of the economy and the natural tendency of technology leads us towards a future in which we can imagine 8 billion or 9 or 10 billion people living at high, well-distributed levels of prosperity. That scenario, I think, is off the table. The models of growth that we do have, which have been rather successful, have on the whole tended to produce inequality, except if there is vigorous counter-steering. In other words, the idea that we can do without politics, which I think was the fantasy of the 1990s or the early 2000s, that you could leave things to the market and you could leave things to privately generated technology, that I think is not something that we should be optimistic about. So that is the challenge that we face, is creative political agency.
And are you optimistic about that challenge being overcome?
I think at this point one has to say, why would one be optimistic, especially given the timeline is so short. I mean, if you take the latest reports on climate change seriously, the time period within which we need to act to prevent irreversible, spectacular and enormously damaging change to the global environment is no longer 50 years, 100 years, it's a matter of 20 to 30 years. That's the window within which we need to decarbonise. And the implications of that, say, for an economy like the Russian one, which is heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, but then more generally on all of Western and affluent societies which are so profoundly dependent on energy input. If you think about the hundreds of millions of people who've acquired air conditioners in Asia, which is an absolutely precondition for a normal, what would we think of as a normal human existence in large parts of China and India in the summer is air conditioning. And that blows all of the electricity consumption calculations out the window. And then the question is, what are the power plants going to be? And if they're coal power plants, as India seems to be planning, and as China continues to build, then the prospects for climate change are truly grim. Then we're talking about scenarios of 3-degree change or higher. And at that point, all bets are off. I mean, at that point, the best science tells us that we're going to face absolutely catastrophic environmental shocks and irreversible change in the distribution of fertile land, inhabitable spaces, huge sea level changes. So, and the only possible response to this is political agency, and we have, an emerging coalition of governments which are climate change denialists. Brazil, the United States, as we saw at the climate conference in Poland this autumn, there is not a consensus amongst the leaders of the most powerful states on earth on the absolute urgency and primacy of this question.
You mentioned Russia's dependence on energy resources, on natural resources in general. So would that mean that Russia is basically a country, one of the countries, who may suffer the most as a result of all those possible changes and developments that you have mentioned?
It's important to emphasize, isn't it, that Russia is not a dependent. I mean, Russia is not a petrostate. That would be a gross exaggeration and would underestimate the dynamic and resources of the rest of the Russian economy and its human potential in general. But it's certainly true that over the last 20 years, 25 years, a large part of the ups and downs in Russian history, a large part of the state revenue has been generated by...
Not even 25, actually it all started back in the 60s, and ever since then it's going up and down, and
it's a major
every
part
time it goes down, it's a disaster, and everybody says, well, we have to change everything within next year or two, otherwise it's going to collapse. And nothing happens. And then it goes up, and everybody says, okay, there is no point to change now because we have to get advantage of the uptrend. And then it repeats and repeats and repeats again and again.
Certainly, I think one would have to say that the asset which gas and oil represent for Russia currently, and it's not just an economic asset, of course, it's a strategic asset, that may be a dwindling asset. If you look at the big OPEC producers like Saudi and so on, they are all now trying to figure out their end game. I think they all understand that the asset that they hold is now valuable. It's not obvious how long it will be valuable for. And they're all trying to figure out what the strategy should be, like maximize production at whatever price or try and keep the price up for as long as you can keep it. In the face now, of course, of the shale revolution in the US, which adds a huge element of flexibility to oil production. So I think we're not, we're at the beginning of the end. We're in the early phases of the end game rather
or
than
end of the beginning.
Say again.
Or end of the
maybe
beginning.
the end of the beginning. Yeah. Well, these are the games one can play endlessly, but it is certainly a fundamental question for Russia going forward.
And for the US, shale revolution, does it have a tremendous impact on the current state of the US economy? And will it have the very same impact in the near future? I mean, is it come and gone, or will it stay forever? I mean, the use of the new resources, new possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, the one-off effect of developing the industry has come and gone, and it was a cyclically driven, it was fed by cheap credit. The ultimate economic limit is the two economic limits. One is the cost of funding, and the other one is the price of oil, right? And so those are the two variables within which shale balances. And there's a sweet spot in between certain levels of funding, certain level of funding costs, and certain oil prices, which will generate an incredibly elastic supply. Plus, there's a culture in that industry until recently of enormous risk-taking. So they were, developing shale regardless of the profitability in the short run because it was the next big thing. I think that will calm down. That has calmed down. The industry is now much more financially disciplined, and the majors have entered into the shale business in a big way, which means that all of a sudden it's players like Exxon who have very complicated algorithms for allocating their capital and are not going to produce the kind of extraordinary wildcat elasticity that you had in the first phase of shale. But it's a permanent feature of the US economy, and one of the things it does is to fundamentally change the American current account. I mean, America used to run a very substantial trade deficit in oil. It no longer does. And in sectors like LNG, it may well emerge as an exporter. This is obviously one of the concerns also of the Trump administration, is to develop those novel markets for LNG with all of the complications that go with that, the building of terminals, the establishment of market links and so on. But that is certainly an element of the US economy. It's very important, though, to understand just how big the US economy is. I mean, it is enormous. It dwarfs any other unit in the world. I mean, you can make the Chinese economy look big by doing purchasing power parity adjustment. But if you leave that out, the US economy is still completely unrivaled in the world. And shale is a big driver of the Texas economy and a big driver of certain of the Midwestern states where it's a big deal. And in those states, you can see huge boom effects. And they are the size of the Spanish economy or approximately the size of the Russian economy. The Texas economy is comparable in size to Russia. But it's not the whole thing. I mean, the entire American economy is massively diversified, is mainly a service sector economy, mainly trading with itself. It has only a 10-15% export-import exposure. It's not very globalized, actually. I mean, people always talk about the impact of globalization on the US. You have to look quite hard to find it. It's not. We're not talking about Singapore or Malaysia or even Belgium or Germany. It's overwhelmingly a domestic economy, and the share that So America, of course, buys a huge quantity of goods from China, but the amount the Chinese realize from the deal is this much, and the amount that the American shipping companies and insurers and retailers and wholesalers and truckers mobilizes.
Therefore, what's
much more.
The story about trade wars then?
If
it's not
politics.
comparable.
It's politics. It's politics.
Yeah, but politics are always driven by economy.
Well, you think that, but that really is the puzzle about the Trump.
You as historian have a different view?
I am as puzzled as anyone, but I think we are coming to the sobering and shocking realization that the Trump administration is not motivated in the way that you would expect a Republican administration to be. And most Republicans...
So it is trade war for the sake of trade war?
It's trade war for the sake of fulfilling a political agenda, which is a real thing. Trump has promised a trade war. He, in his head, has these imaginations about blue-collar workers in America in steel, of which there are hardly any, in mines, in coal mines, of which there are even fewer. There are more gym instructors in America than coal miners. But coal miners and coal need to be protected against climate change. Seriously, far more gym instructors than coal miners. But in Trump's mind, we're still in the 1950s. And so that is the war that he has to deliver. You can try as hard as you like to explain to him that there are far more Americans who process steel and aluminium than Americans who make steel and aluminium. And it still doesn't get through, right? Because he has promised a tariff on the primary material, which is a crazy place to put a tariff. In a sophisticated economy, you put the tariff on the end products so as to protect the bit where you actually compete. And there's been a huge mobilization of business lobbies to prevent him from exiting NAFTA, for instance. There was a serious push in the first spring of his administration to just exit, do a no-deal NAFTA exit, which would have been horrendous for American business. So there was a huge mobilization of lobbyists to prevent him from acting. So it's a very any simple story that one might have about Trump as the tool of business interests. He, of course, is a businessman, and there are certain sorts of business he really likes, but they tend to be in the sort of casino sector or, national, local friends of his, buddies, cronies, rather than the strategic players of the American corporate world, the Exxons or the Goldman Sachses or the Googles or the Apples, right? They're systematic Davos kind of vision of the interests of business is not well represented in this administration. The Democrats are much more on message than the Republicans.
Since you touched upon the deeds of the administration, any comments on the wall in the south of the country?
Oh, I mean, this is a further expression of the utterly toxic politics of the Trump administration. It's a form of sadistic politics. I mean, the aim of the game is to hurt people, to be seen to be hurting people. It's the most kind of brutal, deterrent kind of vision. It's not in the economic interests of the United States. If you build the wall, the calculations originally, when they were planning to do it out of concrete, was that they'd end up buying Mexican concrete to build the wall. God knows where the steel would come from that they're now planning to use. I mean, it's an extraordinary expression of the irrationality of this administration.
And I'm afraid that's a perfect statement that you made to end this interview, which was really informative. And thank you very much for your opinions expressed. And I believe our audience will enjoy.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me on.